1 year after the investigation, Preston University hosted a conference on academic equality. Educators from across the country came to learn about their initiatives. Our student was asked to speak, sharing his story with a packed auditorium. This was never just about one professor or one student, he told them. It was about building a future where education truly opens doors for everyone, where talent and hard work matter more than anything else. His younger siblings sat in the front row, beaming with pride. His sister had made a sign, "My brother changed his university." The simplicity of her words captured the truth of what had happened. Today, our student is in his final year of medical school. His story is taught in education courses as an example of how speaking up can create lasting change. The initiative for academic equality has expanded to dozens of universities, protecting thousands of students. But perhaps the most meaningful change can be seen in the small moments, like when a nervous first-year student raises their hand in class, knowing they'll be heard, or when a young person from any background walks into a college interview, confident that they'll be judged fairly. The elderly pharmacist still keeps that notebook of stories. Sometimes, when new students come in looking worried or discouraged, he shares them. Remember, he tells them, one person standing up for what's right can change everything. And in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not just about fighting discrimination or correcting injustice, but about how courage and truth can transform an institution. About how standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, can open doors for generations to come. As our student walks through campus now, he often thinks about that failed paper that started it all. It wasn't just about grades or academic success. It was about dignity, fairness, and the belief that education should be a path open to everyone who dreams of making a difference in the world. And that's a lesson worth more than any grade could ever be. Justice, when it finally comes, can take unexpected forms. The morning the university announced its decision, the campus was unusually quiet. Students gathered in small groups, checking their phones and waiting for news. The investigation's findings had been unanimous and undeniable. Dr. Wells's tenure was terminated, a rare and serious step in academic circles, but that was just the beginning. The university's response went far beyond a single personnel decision. They announced the creation of a new initiative named after our student and the young woman who had recorded the discrimination, the Initiative for Academic Equality. The program would establish new grading oversight procedures, create an independent review board for student complaints, and require regular audits of grading patterns across all departments. Most importantly, it would provide support and resources for students who faced discrimination of any kind. The news spread quickly across campus. In the medical building's lobby, students hugged and cried. Some were celebrating their own vindication. They had faced similar treatment in the past. Others were thinking about future students who would now be protected. Our student received the news while at work in the pharmacy. The elderly pharmacist had tears in his eyes as he read the announcement on his phone. "You did it, son," he said softly. "You really did it." But the story wasn't over. As news of the case spread, other universities began reaching out. They wanted to learn about the investigation process, to understand how to implement similar protective measures on their own campuses. Preston University's Initiative for Academic Equality was becoming a model for institutional change. The young woman's recordings became part of training materials for new professors, teaching them how to recognize and avoid unconscious bias in their classrooms. The statistical analysis methods developed during the investigation were adopted by other schools as tools for monitoring grading fairness. Back at home, our student's family celebrated in their own way. His younger sister had made a cake, slightly lopsided but frosted with love. "Does this mean you're going to be a doctor now?" she asked, her face smeared with chocolate. "It means I have a fair chance to become one," he answered, hugging her tight. "And so does everyone else." The university's review of Dr. Wells's past grades revealed the full scope of his impact. Hundreds of students had been affected over the years. The administration took the extraordinary step of offering to review and potentially adjust these grades. For some former students, this meant a second chance at their dreams. One morning, a letter arrived from a woman who had been in Dr. Wells's class 15 years ago. "I gave up on medical school after failing his class," she wrote. "I'd always wondered if I wasn't good enough. Now I know the truth. My daughter is in high school now, dreaming of becoming a doctor. Thanks to you, her path will be different. The pharmacy became a symbol of hope in its own way. Students would stop by just to share their stories or seek advice. The elderly pharmacist kept a special notebook where he collected these stories, saying they were part of history now. You know what the best part is? He told our student one quiet evening, it's not just about grades anymore. It's about dignity. It's about justice. It's about making sure everyone gets a fair shot at their dreams. The university's commitment to change went beyond words. They established a scholarship fund for students who had been forced to abandon their medical studies due to discrimination. They hired specialists to review their admissions processes, teaching methods, and evaluation systems. Our students' failed research paper was officially regraded by a panel of independent professors. It received the highest possible marks and was published in a prestigious medical journal. But more importantly, it became a symbol of resilience and the fight for academic justice. The following semester brought visible changes to Preston University. New faces appeared in advanced classes, students who might have been discouraged before. The atmosphere in lectures was different too, more open, more inclusive, more focused on learning than judgment. The young woman who had recorded the discrimination was offered a position on the new review board after graduation. We need people who aren't afraid to speak up, the dean told her. People who understand what's at stake. The young woman's recordings became particularly important evidence. In one clip, Dr. Wells could be heard telling a student, perhaps your kind would be more comfortable in a less challenging field. The room fell silent when this recording was played during a committee meeting. Our students' failed research paper became a central piece of evidence. The investigation team had it reviewed by professors from other universities, all of whom agreed it was graduate-level work. One reviewer even asked permission to cite it in their own research. The pharmacy became an unofficial gathering place for supporters. Customers who heard about the case would leave encouraging notes. Local doctors who remembered their own struggles in medical school stopped by to offer words of support. The elderly pharmacist kept a jar of candy on the counter, saying everyone needed a little sweetness during difficult times. Late one evening, as the investigation team was reviewing their findings, a senior member sat back in his chair and said quietly, "This isn't just about one professor or one student anymore. This is about changing the system." He was right. The investigation had uncovered not just individual acts of discrimination, but systemic problems that had gone unchecked for years. The university would need to do more than just address one professor's behavior. They would need to reimagine their entire approach to academic fairness. As the team prepared their final report, there was a sense that they were participating in something historic. This case would set precedents, change policies, and protect future generations of students from similar discrimination. The question wasn't just whether Dr. Wells would face consequences for his actions. The real question was how the university would transform itself to ensure this could never happen again. The answer would affect not just Preston University, but potentially change how universities across the country handled issues of academic discrimination. The investigation team's final meeting lasted until dawn. As the sun rose over the campus, casting early morning light through the conference room windows, they looked at each other with tired but determined eyes. They knew their findings would change lives, not just for current students, but for generations to come. The investigation that followed shook Preston University to its core. What started as one student's complaint had opened a floodgate of revelations that nobody was prepared for. The university assembled a special investigation team, combining faculty members, administrative staff, and even 2 independent educational consultants. The team worked tirelessly, converting a conference room into their headquarters. The walls soon became covered with charts, statistics, and timeline maps. Boxes of old grade records lined the floor, each one telling its own story of systematic unfairness. "It's like peeling an onion," one investigator commented, rubbing her tired eyes after another long day. Every layer reveals something new. The numbers were shocking. Over his 20-year tenure, Dr. Wells had failed minority students at a rate 4 times higher than others. The pattern was so clear that even the most skeptical committee members couldn't deny it. But it wasn't just about failing grades, it was about dreams derailed, careers delayed, and potential wasted. Former students began reaching out after hearing about the investigation. Their emails and letters poured in, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. Some had given up their medical dreams after failing Dr. Wells' class. Others had transferred to different schools, taking on additional student loans in the process. A few had persevered and become doctors despite his efforts, but the emotional scars remained. One afternoon, a gray-haired man walked into the investigation room. He'd driven 6 hours after hearing about the case. I was in his first class, he explained, his voice thick with emotion. 20 years ago, he failed me too. I always thought it was my fault. The investigation team discovered something else disturbing: Dr. Wells' private emails. They revealed explicit bias in his grading decisions, with comments that made even the most seasoned investigators wince. He had been carefully documenting his own discrimination, perhaps believing his position made him untouchable. Our student continued his regular routine during the investigation, attending classes, working at the pharmacy, helping his siblings with homework. But he noticed changes around campus. Professors in other departments began paying more attention to their grading practices. Students became more willing to speak up about unfair treatment. Something was shifting in the university's culture. The elderly pharmacist watched these developments with satisfaction. "You know," he told our student during a quiet evening shift, "sometimes it takes one person standing up to show others they can stand too." In the library, students had started a support group for others who had faced discrimination. They shared stories, offered advice, and helped each other navigate the university's complaint procedures. The young woman who had recorded Dr. Wells' classes became an unofficial mentor to younger students dealing with similar situations. At home, our student's younger sister proudly told her friends, "My big brother is fixing his school to make it better for everyone." Her simple understanding of the situation often brought a smile to his tired face. The investigation team's work was meticulous. They cross-referenced grades with student records, analyzed patterns in class participation, and reviewed years of student evaluations. They interviewed current students, former students, other professors, and administrative staff. Each interview added another layer to their understanding. One particularly revealing discovery came from the university's archives. A former administrator had kept detailed notes about student complaints against Dr. Wells, despite being told to discard them. These records showed that concerns about his behavior had been raised and ignored multiple times over the years. The team also found evidence that Dr. Wells had interfered with students' graduate school applications and career opportunities. His negative recommendations had prevented qualified students from advancing in their chosen fields. Some had never recovered from these setbacks. As the investigation progressed, support grew stronger. Other universities began conducting their own reviews of grading practices. Educational journals requested interviews about the case. Civil rights organizations offered their support and resources. Inside the conference room, the discussion continued. Committee members asked tough questions, examined evidence, and debated the implications. Our student answered their questions calmly and clearly, his voice growing stronger with each response. The young woman who had recorded the classes spoke last. "This isn't just about grades," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is about making sure every student has a fair chance to learn and succeed." As the committee prepared to make their decision, the dean asked if anyone had any final statements. Our student stood up, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "I'm not here just for myself," he said. "I'm here for every student who came before me and faced the same unfair treatment. I'm here for every student who might come after me. We're all here because we believe in justice, in fairness, and in the power of education to change lives." The room fell silent after his words. Even Dr. Wells seemed to have lost his earlier arrogance, sitting quietly with his eyes fixed on the table. Outside, the waiting crowd had grown larger. Students who had never even taken Dr. Wells' classes came to show support. The message was clear. This wasn't just about one professor or one student. This was about standing up for what was right. As night fell over the campus, the committee reached their decision. The dean's secretary emerged from the conference room, her face serious but her eyes kind. "They're ready," she announced. No one knew it yet, but this moment would mark a turning point in Preston University's history. The decision about to be announced would echo through the halls of academia for years to come, inspiring other students at other universities to stand up against injustice. For now, though, our student simply stood up, straightened his shoulders, and walked back into the conference room, carrying with him the hopes and support of an entire community. Taking action against injustice is never easy, but sometimes it's necessary. The morning our student walked into the Academic Affairs office, his heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. He carried with him a thick folder containing his failed research paper, along with detailed notes comparing it to other students' work. The office was quiet except for the gentle hum of computers and the clicking of keyboards. The secretary looked up, surprised to see a student so early in the morning. "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. "I need to file a formal complaint," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. He'd practiced these words in front of his bathroom mirror countless times the night before. What he didn't expect was her response. "About Dr. Wells?" she asked quietly. When he nodded, she reached under her desk and pulled out a thick folder. "You're not the first one this week." Indeed, he wasn't alone. Over the past few days, a steady stream of students had been making their way to various university offices, each carrying pieces of evidence. The young woman's recordings had been submitted to the ethics committee. The teaching assistant's grade comparisons had gone to the department head. The statistical analysis had been sent to the board of trustees. Word spread quickly across campus. In the cafeteria, students gathered in small groups, talking in hushed voices about what was happening. Some shared their own experiences with Dr. Wells, stories they'd kept quiet for years. Others expressed worry about potential backlash. The elderly pharmacist noticed the tension in his young employee during work hours. "You did the right thing," he said, watching the student organize medications with shaking hands. Sometimes doing the right thing feels scary at first. At home, his younger siblings sensed something was wrong. His sister brought him her favorite stuffed animal one evening. "When I'm worried about something at school, hugging Mr. Bear helps," she said solemnly. The simple gesture nearly brought tears to his eyes. The university's response was surprisingly swift. Within days, the dean called a special meeting of the ethics committee. Our student found himself sitting in a large conference room, surrounded by professors and administrators. The dean's face was grave as she reviewed the evidence. "We've received multiple complaints," she began, her voice careful and measured. "The evidence submitted is concerning." One by one, students presented their cases. The young woman played her recordings, her hands trembling slightly as she operated her phone. The teaching assistant shared her grade analyses, pointing out the clear patterns of discrimination. Alumni testimonies were read aloud, each one adding weight to the case. Dr. Wells was given a chance to respond. He arrived at the hearing looking confident, even smug. "These accusations are ridiculous," he declared. "I've been teaching here for 20 years. My grading standards are high, that's all." But the evidence was overwhelming. When confronted with the statistical analysis of his grading patterns, his confidence wavered. When shown the video recordings, his face paled. When presented with the comparisons of graded papers, he struggled to explain the discrepancies. The meeting lasted for hours. Outside the conference room, students gathered in the hallway, waiting anxiously for news. Some had brought coffee and snacks to share. Others worked on homework together, trying to distract themselves from the tension. Our student's younger brother had insisted on making him a good luck card that morning. Now he held it in his pocket, running his fingers over the crayon-drawn hearts whenever his courage wavered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the building's windows, more people joined the waiting crowd. The elderly pharmacist had closed the pharmacy early to come show his support. Former students who had heard about the hearing drove in from neighboring cities. Even some professors from other departments stopped by to express their solidarity. In the library's computer lab, students began compiling everything into a comprehensive digital file. Video recordings, graded papers, statistical analyses, student testimonies, it all painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The young woman who had started recording the classes finally made her decision. With trembling hands but a steady voice, she walked into the dean's office one morning. She carried with her not just evidence of injustice, but the hopes of countless students, past, present, and future. What she didn't know was that she wasn't alone. At that very moment, Dozens of other students were submitting their evidence through official channels. The elderly pharmacist had helped coordinate with alumni who were sending letters of support. Even some faculty members, long silent out of fear or institutional pressure, were preparing to speak up. Our student, still unaware of much of this activity, continued his daily routine, helping his siblings, studying hard, working at the pharmacy. But he noticed something had changed in his classmates' eyes when they looked at him. There was a new kind of respect there, not just for his academic abilities, but for his quiet dignity in the face of injustice. Change was coming to Preston University. The evidence was too strong, the voices too numerous to ignore. Dr. Wells's carefully constructed facade of authority was about to crumble, brought down not by a single dramatic confrontation, but by the patient, persistent documentation of truth. As the sun set over the campus that evening, casting long shadows across the historic buildings, no one could have predicted just how far-reaching the consequences of these actions would be. Sometimes the most powerful changes start not with a shout, but with the quiet click of a phone's record button, the careful preservation of papers, and the courage to say, "This isn't right." Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions. In this case, it began with a young woman's shaking hands as she pulled out her phone to show her father what she'd been recording all semester. As a member of the university's board of trustees, he sat in stunned silence watching video after video of Dr. Wells's behavior in class. The recordings painted a clear picture. They showed the professor repeatedly ignoring raised hands, making dismissive comments, and treating students differently based on their appearance. But what made the evidence particularly powerful was its consistency, the same pattern day after day, class after class. "I didn't know what to do," she explained to her father, her voice trembling. "But when I saw that research paper get failed, Dad, it was brilliant. Everyone in class knew it. Even other professors had praised it." Meanwhile, in the library's quiet study room, other students were gathering their own evidence. One by one, they compared their papers with the failed research project. The differences were striking. Papers that had received grades showed less research depth, fewer citations, and simpler analysis. Some even contained minor errors that had been overlooked. A teaching assistant who had helped grade papers for another biochemistry class came forward with more information. She had kept copies of previous exemplary papers, papers that Dr. Wells himself had used as examples of excellence. Comparing these with the failed research paper revealed something shocking. The failed paper was actually more comprehensive and better researched than the supposed gold standards. The evidence wasn't just about one paper, though. Students began sharing their class notes, comparing how their answers were received differently. One student had actually written down identical answers to the same question on 2 different days. When given by different students, the responses received dramatically different reactions from Dr. Wells. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source, the university's own records. A graduate student working in the registrar's office had noticed some troubling patterns in Dr. Wells's grading history. Over the years, there was a clear statistical disparity in how he graded different students. The numbers told a story that couldn't be explained away by chance. The young woman who had been recording the classes was still hesitant about coming forward. What if it makes things worse? She worried during a late-night study session. What if no one believes us? Her concerns weren't unfounded. Dr. Wells had been at Preston University for over 20 years. He had tenure, connections, and a reputation for being untouchable. Some students had tried to raise concerns in the past, but their complaints had mysteriously disappeared into administrative black holes. But this time was different. This time they had evidence, real, undeniable evidence. The pharmacy where our student worked became an unexpected meeting place. During quiet evening shifts, students would stop by to share their stories, add their evidence to the growing collection. The elderly pharmacist watched it all with quiet approval, occasionally offering wise advice about the importance of standing up for what's right. "You know," he said one evening, "I've been in this community for 40 years. I've seen a lot of injustice swept under the rug. But I've also seen what happens when people finally say enough is enough." Word began spreading beyond the biochemistry department. Students from other classes started coming forward with their own stories about Dr. Wells. A pattern emerged stretching back years. Some alumni even sent emails sharing their experiences from a decade ago. One evening, as our student was helping his younger sister with her science homework, she asked him a simple but profound question. If someone's being mean and unfair, shouldn't you tell the principal? He smiled at her elementary school solution to a complex problem. But in a way, she was right. Sometimes adult problems needed to be approached with a child's sense of simple justice. The evidence continued to mount. A former teaching assistant found old grading rubrics that showed how standards were applied differently to different students. Another student discovered that several highly qualified applicants to the graduate program had been rejected based solely on Dr. Wells' recommendations that seemed to follow a troubling pattern. That evening at the pharmacy, his elderly mentor noticed his subdued mood. "Bad day?" the pharmacist asked, placing a grandfatherly hand on his shoulder. For the first time, he let his guard down and shared the whole story. The pharmacist listened intently, his frown deepening with each detail. When the student finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment. "You know," the pharmacist finally said, "sometimes the hardest battles end up being the most important ones. Not just for us, but for everyone who comes after." At home that night, as he helped his sister with her homework, she noticed the sadness in his eyes. "Did something bad happen?" she asked with a child's directness. He managed a small smile. "Sometimes life isn't fair," he explained, "but that doesn't mean we give up." Later, alone in his room, he spread out his failed paper and began to read it again, this time taking careful notes. If Dr. Wells wanted to fail him, he would need to justify every point. As he worked, his initial shock and hurt began to transform into something else: determination. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would become a catalyst for change at Preston University. His quiet strength in the face of injustice was about to inspire a movement that would transform not just his own future, but the futures of countless students to come. What he did know, as he sat at his desk late into the night, was that tomorrow would bring new challenges, and he would face them just as he'd faced every other obstacle in his path to becoming a doctor. Because sometimes the most important lessons in medical school have nothing to do with medicine at all. The turning point came with the submission of the semester's major research paper. For weeks, our student had poured his heart and soul into this project, spending countless late nights in the library's quiet study room, surrounded by stacks of medical journals and biochemistry texts. The topic was groundbreaking: a novel approach to enzyme therapy that could potentially revolutionize treatment for certain genetic disorders. His younger siblings had barely seen him during this time, except for the quick meals they shared where he'd explain his research with such passion that even his 10-year-old sister could understand the basics. "So you're trying to help sick people get better by fixing tiny machines in their bodies?" she'd asked one evening, making him smile at her simple but accurate interpretation. The paper itself was extraordinary. He'd consulted with researchers at other universities, corresponded with practicing physicians, and even interviewed patients dealing with enzyme deficiencies. The bibliography alone was 12 pages long. Other professors who caught glimpses of his work during the research phase were visibly impressed. Dr. Rodriguez had even pulled him aside after class one day. "This is graduate-level research," she'd whispered, eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Have you considered publishing this?" The day he submitted the paper, there was a quiet confidence in his step. For once, he felt certain that even Dr. Wells couldn't find fault with this work. He'd had 3 other professors review it unofficially, and all had suggested it was worthy of top marks. One had even joked about stealing some of his ideas for their own research. The waiting period was tense. He kept busy with his usual routine, working at the pharmacy, helping his siblings, attending study groups, but his mind often wandered to the paper. His classmates, who had seen portions of his research during study sessions, were equally anxious to hear the results. Then came the day of the grades. The atmosphere in the lecture hall was already tense when Dr. Wells began returning the papers. One by one, students received their grades. There were smiles, a few disappointed sighs, and some neutral shrugs. Then Dr. Wells reached our student's desk. The professor's face wore an expression that mixed satisfaction with false concern as he placed the paper face down on the desk. Red ink bled through the back of the pages, never a good sign. With steady hands that betrayed none of the anxiety he felt, our student turned over his paper. Failed. The room seemed to spin for a moment. Failed? He blinked, thinking perhaps he'd misread the grade. But there it was, written in harsh red ink at the top of his paper. F. See detailed comments. The comments were anything but detailed. Vague criticisms littered the margins. Lacks depth. Unclear reasoning. Questionable research. Not up to university standards. None of these comments pointed to specific issues or offered concrete suggestions for improvement. The most telling comment came at the end. Perhaps you should consider whether advanced medical studies are the right path for someone with your background. The last word was underlined twice. A soft gasp from behind him told him he wasn't the only one who'd seen the grade. His classmates, many of whom he'd helped understand complex concepts during study sessions, stared in disbelief. They'd seen his research process, witnessed his dedication, and benefited from his insights. During the rest of the lecture, he sat perfectly still, absorbing the shock. The professor's voice droned on about enzyme kinetics, but the words seemed to come from far away. His mind was racing, reviewing every paragraph of his paper, trying to understand where he could have gone so wrong. After class, several classmates approached him, offering support and expressing their confusion. "This doesn't make sense," one whispered. "Your explanations of these concepts helped me get an A on my paper." The young woman who had been documenting classroom incidents approached him with tears in her eyes. "This isn't right," she said firmly. "We all know it isn't right." His study group partners noticed the change. They started making extra efforts to support him, highlighting his contributions during group discussions and backing up his points with additional research. One student, who had a parent on the university's board of trustees, seemed particularly troubled by the situation, often staying after study sessions to document specific instances of unfair treatment. The tension reached a new level during a crucial lab experiment. Everyone's results were showing expected patterns except for his group's data, which seemed suspiciously skewed. Upon closer inspection, his lab partner discovered their assigned reagents were mislabeled, something that had never happened in any other group samples. Through it all, he maintained his composure, channeling his energy into helping other students understand difficult concepts during study groups. He found strength in these moments, explaining complex biochemical pathways to grateful classmates who often commented that his explanations were clearer than the lectures. The local coffee shop owner, who had come to know him through his early morning study sessions, would sometimes wave away his money, saying, "This one's on the house. You're going to be a great doctor someday." These small gestures of kindness helped keep his spirit strong. As the semester progressed, more students and even a few teaching assistants began documenting the disparities they observed. What started as whispered concerns in library corners was slowly growing into a quiet but determined movement for change. Unknown to our student, his dignified response to unfair treatment was inspiring others to take action. The breaking point was approaching, a moment that would expose long-hidden institutional issues and catalyze meaningful change. But for now, he continued his daily routine, helping his siblings with breakfast, catching the early bus to campus, and pursuing his dreams with quiet determination, unaware that his personal struggle would soon become a powerful force for transformation at Preston University. The winter semester at Preston University brought more than just cold winds and early sunsets. Inside the warmth of the medical building's lecture halls, a subtle but troubling pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. It started with the little things. During Dr. Wells's advanced biochemistry lectures, our hardworking student would raise his hand, armed with insights from hours of additional research he'd done at the library. The professor's eyes would scan the room, deliberately passing over him as if he were invisible. At first, he thought maybe he wasn't raising his hand high enough, or perhaps he was sitting in a blind spot. He even changed seats several times, moving from the back to the middle and finally to the front row. But the pattern continued. One morning, while discussing protein synthesis, he offered a well-researched answer about new findings in enzyme catalysis. Instead of acknowledging the valid points, Dr. Wells merely raised his eyebrows and replied, "Interesting that you'd think that," before quickly calling on someone else who gave a less detailed answer but received enthusiastic praise. The other students weren't blind to what was happening. A young woman who sat 2 rows behind him started keeping a small notebook, discreetly documenting these interactions. She wasn't the only one. A group of students had begun exchanging worried glances whenever these moments occurred. During study groups in the library's quiet corners, they would discuss the unfairness in hushed tones. "Did you see what happened in class today?" They'd whisper, "It's not right." His answer was straight from the latest research paper in the Journal of Biochemistry. Our student tried different approaches. He started coming to class 15 minutes early, hoping to engage Dr. Wells in casual conversation about the subject matter. The professor would suddenly become deeply absorbed in reorganizing his papers or would quickly step out for an important phone call. During office hours, he'd find a sign saying "meeting in progress" or "by appointment only," despite the posted open-door policy. The situation became more obvious during group presentations. When teams were presenting their research projects, Dr. Wells would interrupt other students with constructive questions, building on their points to create teaching moments. But when our student presented, the interruptions took a different tone. The professor would question basic concepts despite the student's demonstrated mastery in other classes. "Are you sure you understand the fundamental principles here?" Dr. Wells would ask, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Perhaps you should review your undergraduate materials." These moments were particularly frustrating because other professors regularly praised his deep understanding of biochemical concepts. Just the previous week, his research analysis had been used as an example of excellent work in Dr. Rodriguez's class. The impact started to weigh on him. He began spending extra hours in the library, triple-checking every fact before speaking up in class. His younger sister noticed he was staying up later, surrounded by even more textbooks than usual. "Are you okay?" she'd ask, bringing him cups of tea late at night. "You already know this stuff better than anyone." His pharmacy co-workers noticed too. During quiet moments at work, they'd find him reviewing biochemistry notes between filling prescriptions. The elderly pharmacist who had become something of a mentor to him pulled him aside one day. "I've been watching you lately," the pharmacist said, concern evident in his voice. "You're working twice as hard as you need to. I've seen your test scores. You know this material inside and out." The student managed a tired smile. "I just want to make sure I'm always prepared," he replied, not wanting to burden others with his struggles. But the situation was taking its toll in subtle ways. He started hesitating before raising his hand in class, second-guessing answers he knew were correct. The confident spark in his eyes dimmed slightly during biochemistry lectures, though it still burned bright in every other class. What he didn't know was that his quiet persistence was inspiring others. A group of students had begun documenting Dr. Wells's behavior, carefully noting each instance of unfair treatment. His story was about to become part of a larger movement for change at Preston University, though he didn't realize it yet. The breaking point would come with the submission of his research paper, a moment that would not only challenge his own resilience, but would eventually transform the entire university's approach to academic fairness. But for now, he continued his daily routine, waking up early, helping his siblings, catching the first bus to campus, and pursuing his dream with unwavering determination. As autumn turned to winter and the campus trees stood bare against the gray sky, he remained focused on his goal. Some evenings, while helping his sister with her science homework, he'd catch a glimpse of their father's old stethoscope hanging on the wall, a reminder of why every challenge was worth facing. Little did he know that his journey through medical school would soon become a catalyst for institutional change, touching lives far beyond the walls of Preston University. The autumn leaves scattered across Preston University's historic campus as students hurried to their morning classes. Among them was a young man who stood out not just for his determined stride, but for the stack of medical textbooks he carefully balanced while sipping his coffee, his daily fuel for the demanding schedule ahead. This first-year medical student had already become something of a legend among his peers. Despite working 20 hours a week at the local pharmacy, he somehow managed to maintain a perfect 4.0 GPA. What made his achievement even more remarkable was that every evening he'd head home to help his younger siblings with their homework, stepping into a parental role since their mother worked night shifts at the hospital. His typical day started at 5 a.m. He'd quietly make breakfast for his siblings, pack their lunches, and catch the first bus to campus. Between classes, he'd study in the library's quiet corner, his textbooks spread out on the worn wooden table, highlighters of different colors helping him organize complex medical concepts. His classmates often wondered how he stayed so focused, but they didn't know about the promise he'd made to his late father to become the doctor their community desperately needed. The professors at Preston couldn't help but notice his exceptional performance. Dr. Anderson from anatomy class frequently used his lab reports as examples. Dr. Rodriguez from physiology would smile knowingly when he raised his hand, anticipating another insightful question. Even the notoriously strict Dr. Chen had written brilliant analysis on his last assignment. But then there was Dr. Wells, the advanced biochemistry professor. From the very first day of class, something felt different in Dr. Wells's lecture hall. While other students received encouraging notes for their answers, our promising student's raised hand seemed to become mysteriously invisible. His thoroughly researched responses were met with raised eyebrows and dismissive gestures. What made it more puzzling was that these same answers would earn praise in study groups later. One particularly memorable morning, he arrived early to biochemistry class, hoping to discuss a complex enzyme pathway he'd been researching. As he approached Dr. Wells's desk, the professor quickly gathered his papers, mumbled something about a faculty meeting, and hurried out, despite the fact that class would begin in 10 minutes. His classmates noticed. They'd exchange looks when Dr. Wells would accidentally skip over his raised hand, or when the professor would make subtle remarks about maintaining traditional academic standards. Some students wanted to speak up, but the stakes felt too high. Dr. Wells wasn't just any professor, he sat on the medical school's advancement committee. Despite these challenges, our student's dedication never wavered. He spent extra hours in the lab, double-checking his experiments. His research paper on innovative enzyme therapy approaches was so well-crafted that Dr. Rodriguez, who happened to read it, secretly told him it was worthy of publication. Between classes, work, and family responsibilities, he found moments of joy in mentoring younger students, particularly those from similar backgrounds. During lunch breaks at the pharmacy, he'd help high school students with their college applications, sharing tips about scholarship opportunities he'd discovered during his own journey. At home, his siblings watched him with admiration. His younger brother would proudly tell his friends, "My big brother's going to be a doctor." His sister would sometimes sneak into his room late at night, finding him asleep at his desk, medical textbooks serving as impromptu pillows. The local community took notice too. The elderly customers at the pharmacy would often seek him out, not just for their prescriptions, but for his kind explanations about their medications. He had a way of breaking down complex medical terminology into simple, understandable language, a skill that would prove invaluable in his future career. But as midterms approached, the tension in Dr. Wells's class became increasingly palpable. The professor's behavior shifted from subtle dismissiveness to more overt criticism. During a presentation about genetic markers, Dr. Wells interrupted repeatedly, questioning basic concepts that he'd never challenge other students about. The discomfort in the room was visible, with several students shifting uneasily in their seats. Throughout it all, our student maintained his composure. He'd been raised to believe that excellence was the best response to prejudice. Each dismissive comment from Dr. Wells only strengthened his resolve to master the material. He started a study group, helping other struggling students understand complex biochemical pathways. Ironically, his thorough understanding of the subject became even more apparent as he helped his classmates grasp difficult concepts.